species interact with one another. And especially when you get species that have important interactions with one another, if one of them responds to temperature and the other doesn't, they can get out of sync with one another. So plants and their pollinators can get out of sync with one another. Insect emergence and the birds that feed on them can be out of sync. Competitors can get out of sync with one another. All kinds of things can go wrong within the community. And because of the unique nature of the Leopold data set, where we've got hundreds of species being monitored, we can actually go into the data and look for some of these ecological relationships that may have been disrupted by the way the species are responding to climate. So, remember the skunk cabbage story. Skunk cabbage, if you look now, I'm reporting now the corrected mean. So the corrected mean for skunk cabbage back in Aldo Leopold's time was April 1st. In more recent data, the average is March 18th. So skunk cabbage is a plant that's responding to temperature. It's definitely blooming almost 2 weeks earlier than it did previously in response to our warmer springs. Well, what does this mean for phoebes? Remember that important relationship that Leopold described as a teenager? Well, it turns out phoebes are responding very much the same way. They are short-distance migrants. They're only going a few hundred miles south. They're experiencing our North American spring, which tends to be somewhat correlated across much of the continent. So it turns out that this relationship is intact. Phoebes arrive on average 1 week after the skunk cabbage starts to bloom. So any of those early arriving phoebes that happen to be lucky enough to have a skunk cabbage around can still take advantage of it and perhaps survive. So here's a very important relationship, life or death relationship for those early arriving phoebes that is intact because both of the species are responding the same way. But that's not true for everything. Remember the great crested flycatcher that arrived that first week in May? Well, sure enough, the corrected mean back in Aldo's time, arrival of May 2nd, the more recent data, May 1st. So here's a species that is not responding. It's a long-distance migrant coming from the tropics. It's arriving on the same schedule. Great crested flycatchers have a problem. And their problem is that they are secondary cavity nesters. They nest in cavities, but they can't create their own cavity. They have to find an existing cavity. And it turns out that existing cavities are a hotly contested resource. Lots of things like cavities. Bees nest in them, all kinds of mammals roost in them, lots of other birds nest in them. And we know from looking at how this hot competition for good quality cavities plays out is that the winning strategy is to get there first and occupy the cavity and keep later arriving species away. Well, that's the problem for the great crested flycatcher. Their most serious nest competitors are residents and short-distance migrants, especially the European starling, which is after exactly the same type of cavity that great crested flycatchers like. European starlings are starting their nesting, they're resident birds, but they are starting their nesting cycle almost a month earlier than they used to, which means that by the time the great crested flycatchers arrive in Wisconsin, starlings have already occupied, one assumes, some of the best nesting cavities, and they've already got young in the nest, which leaves the great crested flycatchers at a competitive disadvantage. They may not find a nesting cavity, or if they find one, it might be a suboptimal cavity where they might not reproduce as well. Does it make a difference? Well, this is what the Breeding Birds Survey tells us about how great crested flycatchers are doing in Wisconsin. Since 1966, when these surveys began, great crested flycatchers have declined by about 30%. I wouldn't be so rash as to say that's entirely due to competition that they're losing because of climate change, but it certainly doesn't help to be on the losing end of a competitive interaction interaction over something as important as a nesting site. So what's the take-home message from all of this? Well, obviously, first and foremost, those records that those of us who love to go out in nature and make observations, those journals, those records that we keep are extremely important. And those of us who do go out and make observations in nature, you almost should consider it an obligation to record what you're observing. And obviously the Leopold and the shorter data indicate how really important those observations can mean, especially for a question like understanding the ecological consequences of climate change. It's obviously messy data, and you have to be very aware that you have to be careful in analyzing it. But phenological data clearly provides one of the best types of evidence that we have about how the ecological community is going to be affected by climate change. Most of you who know about Leopold will know that he had a heart attack while fighting a grass fire on the neighbor's farm. He died on April 21st, 1948. And the way Leopold kept his observations is that he had a tiny little notebook that he'd keep in his pocket, in which he'd jot down his observations. And then when he came home in the evening, he'd write them out longhand in his proper journals. So this was the little pocket notebook that was in Aldo Leopold's pocket when he died. The grass fire swept over him and singed. But if you look at the last words that Aldo Leopold wrote, lilac shoots 2 inches long. The only lilac within miles of the shaft was Mrs. Leopold's lilac that she planted to spruce the place up. But you'll also note that the lilac shoots were 2 inches long on April 21st. I don't know how the lilacs were in La Crosse, but the lilacs were in bloom in the middle of March in Madison. So a very big difference. And you'll notice he had bloodroot still in flower in the first, in late April. The bloodroot was all done in March in Madison. So for those of us that